The earth itself seemed to recoil. It was the 2nd of October, in the year of our Lord 1552, and the ground beneath the fortress, city of Kazan, did not merely shake, it shattered. For weeks, the air had been thick with the sulphurous choke of black powder and the desperate prayers of two colliding civilizations, but this morning was different. This was the moment the fuses burned down to the barrels of gunpowder packed deep within the secret tunnels dug beneath the city walls. When the explosion finally came, it tore through the timber and clay defenses of the Tatar stronghold with the force of a divine judgment. Massive sections of the ramparts were lifted into the sky, dissolving into a deadly rain of splinters and dust. As the smoke began to clear, revealing the gaping wound in the city's side, a roar rose up from the besieging army, a collective cry from 150,000 throats. Leading them was a tall, intense young man of 22, a ruler who had crowned himself with a title never before used by a Russian prince, Tsar. This was Ivan IV, not yet fully known as the Terrible, and he was standing on the precipice of history. What happened in the blood-soaked hours that followed would not only crush the last major holdout of the Golden Horde's legacy on the Volga, but would fundamentally transform Russia from a medieval forest state into a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire. To understand the sheer magnitude of the siege of Kazan, one must cast a gaze back through the centuries, into the long, dark shadow that the Mongol Empire had cast over the East Slavic lands. For nearly 300 years, the Russian principalities had existed under what historians later termed the Tatar yoke. The Golden Horde, the western fragment of Genghis Khan's vast dominion, had held the Russian princes in a humiliating grip of servitude. They demanded tribute, they dictated politics, and they required the princes to travel to the steppes to beg for the right to rule their own people. While the direct power of the Golden Horde had fractured by the 15th century, splitting into smaller warring khanates, the psychological scar remained. Among these splinters of the old empire, the Khanate of Kazan was the most formidable and the most dangerous to the rising power of Moscow. Situated at the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers, Kazan was a wealthy, fortified trading hub that controlled the vital arteries of commerce between the forests of the north and the markets of the Caspian Sea and Persia. But it was more than a trade rival. It was a constant military threat. For decades, Kazan had launched slave raids into Russian territory, dragging tens of thousands of captives back to the markets of the East. The relationship between Moscow and Kazan was a pendulum of violence, swinging between uneasy truces and brutal border wars. By the time Ivan IV ascended the throne, the situation had become untenable. This was a young monarch possessed of a burning, almost feverish ambition. He was the first Grand Prince to be crowned Tsar, a title derived from Caesar, implying an imperial dignity equal to the emperors of Old Rome or Byzantium. But a title is meaningless without the power to back it up. Ivan needed a victory that would validate his divine right to rule, a victory that would secure his southern borders and open the Volga to Russian trade. He saw Kazan not just as a military objective, but as a religious and existential imperative. It was a crusade. However, the road to 1552 was paved with failure. Ivan had tried to take Kazan before. In the winters of 1547 and 1549, he had marched his armies into the frozen steppes, only to be beaten back not by the Tatars, but by the logistics of war. The thaw had turned roads into quagmires, the artillery had sunk in the mud, the supply lines had snapped. The humiliation was profound. The young Tsar returned to Moscow with his army in tatters, realizing that bravery alone would not breach the walls of Kazan. He needed a revolution in warfare. What followed was one of the most remarkable periods of military reform and strategic preparation in Russian history. Ivan and his advisors realized that to take a fortress as distant and well-defended as Kazan, they could not rely on the old feudal levies, the ragtag groups of peasants led by noblemen. They needed a professional corps. This led to the creation of the streltsy, the musketeers. Armed with arquebuses and heavy bardiches, uniformed and paid by the state, the streltsy were the first standing army in Russia. They brought a disciplined, lethal firepower that the mobile cavalry of the steppes was ill-equipped to handle. But Ivan's preparations went beyond just men. He engaged in a feat of engineering that rivaled the tactics of the Roman legions. He realized that the campaign failed previously because the army had no base of operations near the enemy territory. They were marching hundreds of miles through hostile wilderness before the battle even began. So, in the winter of 1551, Ivan ordered the construction of a fortress, but not in the usual way. Deep in the Russian forests, 1,000 miles upstream from Kazan, his engineers built a full-scale wooden fortress. They numbered every log, marked every beam, and then dismantled it. When the spring thaw came, they floated the entire fortress down the Volga River on rafts. Within 4 weeks, on a strategic island just 20 miles from Kazan, the Russian army assembled the town of Sviashk. It rose from the ground like magic, a fully fortified logistics hub right on the enemy's doorstep. The psychological impact on the Tatars was devastating. They looked out from their walls to see a Russian city where there had been only forest a month before. It was a clear signal. Ivan was not coming to raid, he was coming to stay. By the summer of 1552, the pieces were in place. Ivan marshaled a colossal force, estimated by some chroniclers to be 150,000 strong. Though modern historians might temper that number, it was nonetheless the largest army Russia had ever fielded. It included the new Streltsy regiments, heavy cavalry, Tatar allies who had defected to Moscow's side, and a vast artillery train. They moved toward Kazan with a grim sense of finality. The city of Kazan was no easy target. Perched on high ground, protected by the Kazanka River and deep ravines, it was encircled by formidable oak walls filled with earth and stone. The defenders, led by Khan Yedigar Mohammed, were well provisioned and desperate. They knew that this was an existential fight. The garrison consisted of tens of thousands of fierce warriors, augmented by the Nogai cavalry and the citizenry themselves who were prepared to fight to the death. The siege began in late August. The Russians encircled the city, cutting off escape routes and trapping the defenders inside, but the early days of the siege were far from a foregone conclusion. The weather turned foul. Torrential rains lashed the Russian camp, turning the trenches into mud pits. A fierce storm destroyed many of the ships carrying supplies, threatening to starve the besiegers before they could starve the besieged. Inside the walls, the Tatar imams climbed the high towers to chant curses upon the Russians, and when the storms intensified, many in the Rusi and camp began to fear that sorcery was at play. Ivan, however, countered with his own spiritual warfare. He brought the holiest icons from Moscow and surrounded himself with priests who marched through the mud, blessing the cannons and the troops. To maintain morale, he was present on the front lines, a visible symbol of determination. But while the Tsar prayed, his engineers worked. This siege would be decided by technology and earth-moving. The Russian forces were overseen by foreign military engineers, likely Danish or German specialists hired by the Tsar. They implemented a strategy of strangulation and demolition. First, they had to deal with the water. Kazan's water supply came from a hidden underground spring accessed by a secret tunnel. Russian prisoners who had escaped the city revealed the location to Ivan. The engineers dug their own tunnels, located the spring, and blew it up with mines. The city was now dry. Disease and thirst began to gnaw at the defenders, but still they refused to surrender. The walls were the next obstacle. The Russian artillery, heavy bronze cannons cast in Moscow, pounded the wooden palisades day and night. But the Tatars were quick to repair the breaches with timber and earth during the darkness. It became clear that a direct assault against the intact walls would be suicide. The solution was a massive siege tower, a medieval skyscraper mounted on wheels, higher than the walls of Kazan. It was rolled slowly, painfully, toward the rampa. From its top platform, the Streltsy could rain musket fire down into the city streets, picking off defenders and suppressing the archers on the walls. Yet, the deciding blow would come from below. The Russian sappers spent weeks digging deep galleries beneath the city's fortifications. It was grueling, claustrophobic work, digging by candlelight, listening for the sounds of counter-mining by the enemy. They packed these chambers with hundreds of barrels of gunpowder. This brings us back to that fateful morning of October 2nd. The mines were primed. The Russian army stood in formation, the silence hanging heavy over the valley. When the explosion ripped the walls apart, the sound was reportedly heard across the entire province. The shockwave knocked men off their feet. Before the dust could settle, the signal was given. The assault was chaotic and visceral. The Russian forces poured through the breaches, but the Tatars did not break. The fighting in the breach was hand-to-hand, a meat grinder of pikes, sabers, and axes. The defenders, knowing that surrender meant slavery or death, fought with the fury of the doomed. They retreated street by street, turning every house into a fortress, every alley into an ambush. Ivan, watching from his command post, waited for the critical moment to commit his reserves. When the initial wave began to bog down in the labyrinthine streets, he signaled the final push. The Tsar's personal regiment, the elite cavalry, rode into the burn. Ing City. The momentum shifted irrevocably. The fighting reached the Khan's palace, the last citadel of resistance. The slaughter that ensued was horrific. The pent-up rage of decades of raids, the religious fervor, and the sheer adrenaline of the assault resulted in a massacre. The streets ran slick with blood. The chronicles describe the piles of bodies blocking the gates, the fires consuming the wooden architecture of the city, and the total collapse of the Khanate hierarchy. Khan Yadigar Mohammed was captured alive, a prize to be paraded in Moscow, but the majority of the garrison was put to the sword. By evening, the city of Kazan, the great rival of Moscow, the successor of the Golden Horde, was no more. It was a smoking ruin, firmly under the boot of the Tsar. The fall of Kazan was not merely the capture of a city, it was a geopolitical earthquake. For the first time, a Russian ruler had conquered a Tatar Khanate. The psychological dynamic that had governed the region for centuries was inverted. The Russians were no longer the tribute payers, they were the conquerors. The Volga River, the longest river in Europe, was now entirely open to Russian ships, connecting Moscow directly to the Caspian Sea and the trade routes of the Silk Road. But the implications went even further east. With Kazan fallen, the dominoes began to tumble. The Khanate of Astrakhan, located at the mouth of the Volga, would fall to Ivan just 4 years later. The path to the Ural Mountains was now clear. The defeat of Kazan removed the barrier that had kept the Russians bottled up in Europe. It opened the door to Siberia. In the decades that followed, Cossack explorers and fur traders would push eastwards with astonishing speed, reaching the Pacific Ocean within a century. The conquest of Kazan was, in effect, the birth of the Russian Empire as a transcontinental power. The victory also had a profound effect on Ivan himself. He returned to Moscow not just as a victor, but as a messianic figure. He had done what his father and grandfather could not. To commemorate the victory, he ordered the construction of a cathedral on Red Square. It was officially named the Cathedral of the Intercession of the Most Holy Theotokos on the Moat, but the world would come to know it as St. Basil's Cathedral. Its iconic swirling onion domes are said by some historians to symbolize the turbans of the defeated Khans, a colorful architectural trophy of war that stands to this day as the ultimate symbol of Russia. However, the legacy of 1552 is complex. For the Tatar people, it was a catastrophe, the loss of independence and the beginning of a long period of cultural and religious suppression. The region was aggressively Christianized in the years that followed. Mosques were destroyed, and the local nobility was forced to convert or lose their lands. It sowed seeds of ethnic and religious tension that would ripple through the centuries. Furthermore, the victory fed Ivan's darkening personality. The absolute power he wielded during the campaign, the success of his autocratic decisions, and the validation of his divine mandate emboldened him. He began to see enemies everywhere, not just on the borders, but within his own court. The discipline and unity shown at Kazan would eventually curdle into the paranoia and terror of the Oprichnina, the state-sponsored purge that would earn him the epithet the Terrible. In the grand tapestry of history, the siege of 1552 stands as a pivot point. It was the moment when the oscillation of power between the steppe nomads and the forest dwellers finally stopped, and the balance tipped permanently in favor of the settled, gunpowder-wielding state. It ended the era of the Mongol heirs on the Volga and inaugurated the era of Russian imperial expansion. When we look back at the events of October 1552, we see more than just a military engagement. We see the collision of eras. We see the medieval world of walls and arrows giving way to the modern world of artillery and standing armies. We see the forging of a national identity in the fires of war. Ivan the Terrible may have been a complex, deeply flawed, and ultimately tragic figure, but on that cold autumn day, amidst the smoke and the ruin of Kazan, he reshaped the map of the world. The explosion that breached the walls did not just open the city, it opened the future, creating a shockwave that is, in many ways, still being felt today. The legacy of Kazan is written in the geography of Eurasia, etched into the stone of St. Basil's, and woven into the very DNA of the Russian state.